Hi everyone, John Dickinson here from MotionWorks, back with part 3 of the Dancing Can. You'll have to excuse the background noise today because there seems to be a lot of cars going past my window, but I'll do my best to edit those out. Now in part 2 we took a look at how to use fractal noise and the grid effect linked up to the music to make the background pulse to the beat. Now in this part we're going to add a shape layer or a couple of shape layers to give the background a more organic look. So let's take a look at the finished lesson. Okay, so you can see that this background has a lot more detail now, and it was very easy to make by using shape layers. So let's just jump straight in and I'll show you how I did it. Now the first thing I want to do is pre-compose these layers we created in the last lesson with the audio amplitude layer, just to tidy up this comp a little bit. Remember, I have to pre-compose with the audio amplitude, otherwise it's going to break the expression that we linked to the grid effect. So if I select all of these, pre-compose, and we'll name this blocks. Notice how the multiply blend mode has now been switched off. And that's what happens when you pre-compose layers that have blend modes into another comp. If I have a look at the blend modes here, you can see that the blend mode here is now normal. So what we want to do is pass through the blend modes from the pre-comp into the main comp. And we can do that using collapse transformations. And we can find the switch for that in the modes panel, just over here, this button here. If I click on it, you can see it says collapse transformations. If this was an Illustrator file, it would say continuously rasterize, because this button here has two functions. But for now it's collapse transformations because it's a comp. So watch what happens when I switch this on. Now you can see that the multiply mode has returned. So it's been passed through from within this blocks comp. So that's just a nice little way to keep your comps organized and still be able to use the blend modes from the layers inside the pre-comps. Alright, so let's just make a star object. I'm just going to turn on my guides and choose the star tool. Now if I click and drag, you can see I've already got a basic style to this star. The shape layer tools basically keep the settings that you used the last time you used the tool. If you want to reset it, you can just do that very simply by double clicking on the tool. So if I double click the star tool, now we've got a default star. But notice it's still got the gradient inside. And this is the gradient I already set up when I was practicing this before I presented to you. Okay, so let's modify this. I'm going to twirl down polystar 1 and polystar path. And I'm going to increase the points to 18. The outer radius, I'm going to drop that to 150. And drop the outer roundness to -80. And just decrease the inner radius, drop that to about 66, something like that. These are the settings I used when I originally designed this animation, but of course you can try any settings that you want. Okay, so next we're going to click on the Add Flyout menu and choose Pucker and Bloat. It's one of the great settings that's been borrowed from Illustrator. I'm going to drop this way down to something like -400. Something like that. I don't want the stroke, so we could turn that off or simply delete it. In this case, I'm just going to delete the stroke. Okay, so that's what we have so far. Just turn off these guides. Now I want to apply wiggle paths. And you can see now the star has a slight wiggle. Let's just modify those settings. I want to increase the size to about 75. And drop the detail to 6 and change points from corner to smooth. That just smooths out the star and makes it look a bit more organic. Okay, next we want to apply a second wiggle. So I'm going to select or make sure wiggle paths 1 is selected and choose add wiggle paths. And this is going to add some extra wiggle to the wiggle we already have. I'm going to keep that wiggle at its default. And you can see this has just added a little bit more detail to the wiggle. Just makes it look a little bit more organic. If I switch it off, this is a kind of smooth, but with the extra wiggle, just adds a bit more detail. I thought that looked a bit more interesting. And of course, wiggle paths has automatic animation. There's no keyframes required for wiggling the path. Okay, next we want to adjust the gradient, because at the moment it's a linear gradient and we want a radial gradient. So I'm going to twirl down gradient fill and change type from linear to radial. And because I have the selection tool selected, I can grab this handle and that allows me to interactively adjust the gradient. Okay, something like that looks pretty good. We can always adjust a bit more later. Okay, so now I'm going to choose the blend mode that I want to use to blend this in with the background, and that will be overlay. Alright, so far so good. What we want to do now is add a bit more detail. When I was designing this, I kind of thought that at this stage the whole thing looked a little bit too sharp, a little bit too computer generated. So I decided to duplicate the star element and create a light burst out of it, and that makes the whole thing look a little bit more softer and a little bit more natural. So let's try that. So I'm going to duplicate shape layer 1. We might just name these actually. I'll name this one star 1 and this one star 2. I'm going to drop star 2 below star 1 and just solo star 2. And for this one, I'm going to remove a whole bunch of the stuff that we applied. I'm going to remove wiggle paths 2, and I'm going to make the size of wiggle paths 1 pretty large, something like 400, something like that. And change this one from smooth to corner. And also drop the detail to 1. So it's exactly what we had with the other star, but just modifying the wiggle paths to give it way more wiggle. Also want to change the fill to solid color. Now I can change the color. I want to make this something pretty light, something like this, like a sort of lilac color. And this is the color I chose when I originally designed this animation. Alright, so now we can just unsolo everything else. And that looks pretty crazy. That just adds extra geometric lines to the whole thing. What we want to do now is add a light effect to this to soften it up. Okay, so I'm going to choose CC Radial Fast Blur and change zoom to brightest and amount to 100. Okay, so you can see the whole thing's now a lot brighter. Let's just preview this. You can see the lighting effect behind the main star is pretty subtle, but it just adds that extra layer of detail to the animation and softens the whole thing up, makes it look a bit more natural. Okay, that's excellent. All we want to do now is just create a vignette to add a bit more richness to the edges of the frame. I'm going to do that using the levels effect and an adjustment layer. So I'll choose layer, new adjustment layer, and just going to rename this one levels. Apply the levels effect. And I'm going to crush the blacks. At the moment that's affecting the entire frame, which is fine. What we want to do though is add a mask to that layer. So the levels layer is selected. So I'm going to double click the ellipse tool and invert that mask and just add some feather. So just feather this right out. Okay, looking nice. You can see this is adding a nice richness to the edges of the animation and giving the whole thing a bit more depth. Let's just preview that. And once again, we've used no manual keyframes. All of the animation created today has been done through the Wiggle Paths animator. Okay, so you get the idea. It's looking pretty nice now, isn't it? What we're going to do in the next class is to reintroduce the can to the scene, and we're going to color correct the can to sit in the scene, make it look like it's part of this scene. And we're also going to apply some text to the animation. So let's just take a look at that spot. Okay, so that's what we're going to be covering in part 4 of the dancing can, the final part of this animation. I look forward to seeing you then.